The wind was a thief. It stole the heat from the sod house through the thinnest cracks in the mud and grass walls. It stole the moisture from her lips until they cracked, and it stole the sound of her own quiet weeping, whipping it away across the frozen plains before it could offer even the barest comfort of echo. Alara knelt on the packed earth floor, the body of her infant daughter, Leah, a feather-light weight against her shoulder. The child's cry was no longer a robust demand for life, but a thin, reedy whimper that seemed to unravel from the very core of her being. It was the sound of a candle flame flickering in a gale, a sound Alara feared she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her days, however few they might be. Her son, Sam, barely 3 years old, was huddled in the corner, his small face streaked with dirt, his thumb plugged firmly in his mouth. He had stopped asking for his father a week ago. He had stopped asking for food this morning. He only watched her with Thomas's solemn gray eyes, a miniature man already acquainted with a grief too large for his frame. The fire in the small hearth was a miserly collection of glowing embers, radiating a pathetic circle of warmth that did little to combat the profound, bone-deep chill of the Dakota Territory winter. She had burned the last of the wood Thomas had chopped, then the chair he had built, and this morning, a crate that had carried their belongings from Ohio. Soon, there would be nothing left to burn but the bed frame. And then, what? The cold was a patient predator, circling their small fortress of earth, waiting for the last flicker of defiance to die. Her own stomach was a hollow, aching cavern, but that pain was a distant drumbeat compared to the sharp, immediate agony of Leah's fading cries. Her milk had dried up 3 days ago, a final, cruel betrayal by a body racked with grief and starvation. Since then, she had tried boiled flour and water, a thin, useless gruel that the baby could barely keep down. Now, there was not even flour left. There was nothing. Nothing but the wind, and the cold, and the vast, crushing emptiness of the land that had swallowed her husband whole. Thomas. His name was a wound in her mind. He had seen promise in this endless expanse of grass and sky. He spoke of roots, of a legacy built from the soil itself. He had dug their home from the earth, slicing the prairie into thick, root-tangled bricks, stacking them one by one. "It's honest, Alara," he'd said, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes alight with a fire she had so loved. "It'll keep us warm in the winter and cool in the summer. It's a part of the land, and we'll be a part of it, too." He had been wrong about the warmth. Or perhaps the house was only as warm as the life within it. Now it felt like a tomb, a premature burial mound on the face of the prairie. He'd gone out to reinforce the lean-to for their lone, bony horse just before the first big snow and had never come back. They found him 2 days later, not 20 yards from the door, a statue of ice, the hammer still clutched in his frozen hand. The land had taken him, and now it was coming for his family. Her gaze fell upon the wooden trunk in the corner, the only fine thing she owned. Inside, nestled in linen, was the quilt. It was not a practical, homespun thing of dull scraps. It was a kaleidoscope of color, a masterpiece of tiny, intricate stitches her mother had sewn over the course of 5 years. Star patterns in vibrant reds and deep blues, squares of marigold yellow and forest green, fabrics purchased with carefully saved egg money. It was her dowry, her connection to a life of green hills and gentle rain, of community and belonging. It smelled of her mother's lavender sachets, of home. It was the last beautiful thing in her world. To part with it would be like tearing out a page of her own history, a page that told of love and safety. But Leah's whimper cut through her thoughts, a tiny, sharp needle of sound. History could not fill a starving belly. Beauty could not warm a dying child. Her decision settled not with a crash, but with a slow, sinking finality, like a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. She would walk to the settlement. She would go to the general store, to the Gables, and she would offer the quilt. Not for credit, not for charity, but for a trade. A piece of her soul for a can of milk. For a chance at one more sunrise. She rose, her joints cracking in protest. She laid Leah gently on the thin mattress, the baby's tiny limbs startlingly still. She pulled the trunk to the center of the room and lifted the heavy lid. The blast of color from the quilt was almost a physical blow. It was so alive in the gray, dim light of the soddy. She lifted it, the fabric cool and heavy in her hands. She ran her fingers over the stitching, a map of her mother's patience and love. A tear, hot and sudden, fell onto a patch of crimson silk. It looked like a drop of blood. She wrapped it carefully in a piece of spare canvas, hiding its beauty as if it were a sin. Then, she swaddled Leah in every blanket she had, leaving Sam with only the thin horse blanket. "I'll be back, Sammy," she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. He didn't respond, only watched her with those huge, unblinking eyes. She bundled Leah to her chest, the tiny body a fragile ember she had to protect from the wind. She took one last look at the bleak interior of her home, the dying fire, the silent boy in the corner. Stepping outside was like walking into the blade of a knife. The wind tore at her, a physical force that sought to push her back into her earthen grave. The sky was a sheet of pewter, low and oppressive. The settlement of Promise was 2 miles away, 2 miles of frozen, rutted track across a landscape that offered no shelter, no comfort, only an unending horizon of white and gray. With the quilt under one arm and her daughter clutched in the other, Elara bent her head against the wind and began to walk. Each step was a battle, a conscious act of will against the screaming gale and the despair that threatened to freeze her from the inside out. The canvas-wrapped bundle felt like a block of lead, a weight of memory and sacrifice. She was trading her past for a future she could not see, a future that might last no longer than a single can of milk. The journey to Promise was a pilgrimage through a frozen hell. The wind was a living entity, a malevolent spirit of the plains that clawed at her skirts, stung her face with ice crystals, and howled in her ears with a chorus of desolate voices. It found every gap in her worn coat, every thin spot in her shawl, sinking its teeth into her flesh. The world was reduced to a blur of gray sky and white ground, the horizon a wavering line that seemed to recede with every painful step she took. She kept her head down, her focus narrowed to the task of placing one frozen foot in front of the other. Beneath the layers of wool and canvas, Leah was terrifyingly still. Elara would pause every few minutes, huddling behind a meager rise in the terrain, and press her ear to the bundle, straining to hear the faint, fluttering heartbeat, the whisper of breath. Each time she found it, a wave of relief so profound it was dizzying would wash over her, giving her the strength to push onward. The settlement, when it finally appeared, was not a beacon of hope but a collection of dark, hunched shapes huddled against the vast whiteness, as if cowering from the sky. Smoke whipped from the chimneys of the few clapboard houses and the single false-fronted general store, instantly shredded and scattered by the wind. There were no people on the street, no children playing, no sign of life save for that desperate, fleeing smoke. Promise. The name felt like a bitter joke, a cruel irony scrawled on a map by someone who had never felt the lash of a Dakota winter. Her first and only destination was Gable's General Mercantile, the heart and lungs of the tiny community. It was where news was traded, supplies were bought, and judgment was quietly passed. She had stood in this store with Thomas, listening to his confident talk of harvests and futures, feeling the warmth of the pot-bellied stove and the cautious welcome of the other homesteaders. Now, she approached it as a beggar. The bell above the door gave a weak, tinny jingle as she pushed her way inside, the sudden warmth and stillness a shock to her system. For a moment, she was blind, her eyes watering from the abrupt change in light. The smells of coffee, cured meat, and kerosene filled her senses, smells of life and plenty that made her own empty stomach clench with a painful cramp. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, a stout woman with a face that seemed permanently pinched in disapproval. 2 other women, wives of local ranchers, stood near the stove, their conversation halting as they turned to stare at her. Their eyes took in her wind-scoured face, her frayed coat, the desperate way she clutched the bundle to her chest. She saw not sympathy in their gazes, but a grim, self-satisfied pity. She was a cautionary tale, the inevitable fate of those who dared to challenge the land and lost. "Mrs. Reed," Martha Gable said, her voice lacking any real warmth. "It is a fearsome day to be out." Elara couldn't speak at first. Her throat was a knot of unshed tears and pride. She walked slowly to the counter, her legs unsteady, and gently placed the canvas-wrapped quilt upon its scarred wooden surface. The other women edged closer, their curiosity piqued. "Mr. Gable," Elara managed, her voice hoarse. Is he here? He is in the back. Tallying accounts, Mrs. Gable did not move to get him. Her eyes were fixed on the bundle. Alara's hands trembled as she untied the rough twine and folded back the canvas. The quilt's colors bloomed in the lamplight, a defiant splash of beauty in the drab store. A low murmur came from the two women by the stove. They recognized quality when they saw it. They also recognized desperation. "It's my mother's," Alara said, the words feeling like a betrayal. "The stitching is fine. The fabrics, some are silk." She felt like a peddler hawking a piece of her own heart. Mrs. Gable reached out a hand, but did not touch the quilt. Her fingers hovered over it, as if its vibrancy might stain her. "It is a lovely thing," she conceded, her tone unchanged. Just then, Mr. Gable emerged from the back room, a thin, sallow man with spectacles perched on his nose. He stopped short when he saw Alara, his expression souring. He knew what this was. He had seen this scene play out before with other unlucky souls. "Alara," he said, his voice flat. He refused to use her married name, a subtle demotion. "We can't extend any more credit. Thomas's account is well. I'm sorry for your loss, but business is business. I'm not asking for credit," Alara said, forcing strength into her voice. She pushed the quilt forward. "I'm asking for a trade. For canned milk. For flour. For whatever this is worth to you." Mr. Gable looked from the quilt to her face, then to the motionless bundle in her arms. A flicker of something, perhaps shame, perhaps irritation, crossed his face. "We are not in the business of trade goods, Alara. We sell supplies. For cash, this is better than cash," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Look at the work. It would fetch a fine price in a city. Your wife." She glanced at Mrs. Gable. "She knows its value." Mrs. Gable turned her face away, busying herself with rearranging a display of tin cans. It was a clear, unmistakable dismissal. The silence in the store was thick and heavy. The only sounds were the crackle of the stove and the relentless moan of the wind outside. It was a public humiliation, a quiet, brutal verdict delivered by her peers. She was an outcast, a failure. Just as she was about to gather her treasure and retreat back into the storm, the bell on the door jingled again. A man stepped inside, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. He was tall and broad, dressed in buckskins and furs that had seen hard use. His face was weathered, his dark hair long and unkempt. It was Silas. He was a man who lived on the periphery, a trapper who kept to himself in a small cabin a mile further out from her own claim. The townspeople spoke of him in whispers. Some said he was a half-breed, others that he was simply a man who preferred the company of the wilderness to that of people. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed out of place in the cluttered store. He nodded once, a curt, all-encompassing greeting to the room, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the quilt on the counter, the rigid posture of the gables, the tears glistening on Alara's frozen cheeks. He did not register surprise, only a kind of quiet observation. He walked to the counter, placing a stack of prime beaver pelts down. The rich, dark fur made the Gables' wares look cheap and shoddy. Mr. Gable's demeanor shifted instantly. This was business he understood. "Silas, good to see you." "A fine catch." Silas ignored him. His gaze rested on the quilt, then moved to Alara's face. He looked at the bundle in her arms, and for a fraction of a second, his expression softened with something that was not pity, but recognition. He had seen what this land could do to a person. He knew the look of someone standing on the edge of a precipice. He turned his attention back to Gable. "She needs milk for the child," he said. It was not a question or a suggestion. It was a simple statement of fact, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Mr. Gable bristled. "That is between her and me." Silas's eyes, dark and steady, held Gable's. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "Give her the milk," he said again, and the quiet authority in those 4 words was more powerful than any threat. The air in the store crackled with a new tension. Alara stood frozen, a spectator in a drama that was no longer her own. Alara stood trapped in the charged silence, the vibrant colors of her mother's quilt a stark contrast to the grim tableau. Mr. Gable's face, usually a mask of smug commerce, was flushed with a mixture of anger and intimidation. He was not a man accustomed to being told what to do in his own establishment, especially not by an outcast like Silas. Yet, he could not dismiss the pile of valuable pelts. nor the unyielding presence of the man who had brought them. "This is not a charity house," Gable sputtered, gesturing vaguely towards Alara. "We all have our hardships. She is not the first widow on these plains." The words were meant to wound, to reduce her suffering to a common, manageable problem, but Silas did not even glance at her. His focus remained entirely on Gable, his stillness a form of immense pressure. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the edge of the quilt, his touch surprisingly gentle. He ran a thumb over a seam, feeling the tightness of the thousands of tiny stitches. "What are you offering?" he asked, his voice directed at Alara, though he did not look at her. The question hung in the air, cutting through Gable's blustering. It was the first time anyone had asked her that, the first time anyone had treated this as a legitimate transaction rather than an act of begging. "The quilt," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For milk." For the baby, Silas's gaze finally shifted to her, and for the first time, she met his eyes directly. They were not cold, as she had imagined, but deep and unreadable, like the surface of a forest pool. There was a profound weariness in them, but also an unnerving clarity. He seemed to see straight through her pride and her fear to the raw, desperate core of her. He looked down at the tiny, swaddled form in her arms, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned back to Gable. A dozen cans of the evaporated milk, a 20-pound sack of flour, and coffee. He pushed the stack of beaver pelts forward an inch. "Take it from my credit." Mr. Gable's eyes widened. This was a windfall, an unexpected turn that soothed his wounded pride with the balm of profit. He glanced at his wife, who gave a slight, sharp nod. The other women by the stove watched, their expressions a mixture of shock and suspicion. Charity was one thing. This was something else entirely. It was an intervention. "Of course, Silas. Of course," Gable said, his tone now obsequious. He began to gather the items, his movements suddenly brisk and efficient. Alara felt a disorienting wave of vertigo. Events were moving around her, beyond her control. This was not the bargain she had come to make. This was a debt, a heavy, undefined obligation to a man she did not know, a man the whole town feared or distrusted. "No," she said, the word coming out stronger than she expected. All eyes turned to her. That wasn't the deal. The quilt, for the milk. A trade. She could not bear to be indebted. A trade was clean. A trade allowed her to keep a sliver of her dignity. Silas looked at her, a long, searching look. He seemed to understand what she was trying to preserve. He picked up the quilt from the counter. The weight of it seemed to settle in his large hands. He didn't inspect it like a merchant, but held it as if weighing its history, its meaning. He folded it slowly, deliberately, the bright patterns disappearing into neat, somber squares. He then did something she did not expect. He held it out to her. "The child needs the warmth more than I need the decoration," he said, his voice low. "Your roof leaks on the north side. Thomas didn't get to finish packing the sod. It needs to be done before the next heavy snow." Her mind struggled to connect these two disparate statements. The quilt, the roof. What did one have to do with the other? I don't understand," she stammered. "I will take the milk and the flour to your place," he continued, as if explaining something very simple to a child. "And I will look at the roof. When the work is done and the child is stronger, we will talk about the quilt." He placed the folded quilt on top of the supplies Gable had stacked on the counter, a clear statement that they were all part of the same transaction. It was not a gift. It was not charity. It was a complex, deferred bargain she could not begin to fathom. She was too exhausted, too cold, too hollowed out by hunger and fear to argue. All she knew was that he had offered a path out of the immediate darkness. He had seen her need and met it, not with pity, but with a strange, practical respect. She looked at the cans of milk, small tins of impossible hope. She thought of Leah, of the sweet, life-giving liquid that would quiet her cries and soothe her small, tormented belly. Nothing else mattered. "All right," she whispered, the single word of assent costing her the last of her strength. Silas gave a curt nod. He looked at Mr. Gable. "Put it all in a crate." He then turned and left the store as abruptly as he had entered, the bell giving another weak jingle in his wake. He did not say goodbye or offer a parting glance. He simply departed, leaving her in a store filled with stunned silence and the tangible promise of survival. Mr. Gable, now eager to please his best supplier of furs, quickly packed the goods. As Alara reached to take the heavy crate, she realized she couldn't possibly carry it, the quilt, and Leah all the way home. As if sensing her predicament, Mrs. Gable spoke for the first time, her voice tight. "Leave it. He will come for it." Alara clutched Leah closer and, without another word, turned and walked back out into the punishing wind. The cold was still just as sharp, the sky just as bleak, but something had fundamentally changed. The despair that had been her constant companion on the walk to town had receded, replaced by a fragile, terrifying tendril of hope. It was a hope tied not to the kindness of a community, but to the inscrutable actions of a lone, silent man. As she trudged back across the frozen prairie, she did not feel saved. She felt bartered for, and she had no idea what the final price would be. The walk back to the soddy was an exercise in pure endurance, but the nature of the struggle had shifted. On the way to promise, she had been fighting against the finality of death. Now, she was fighting for the fragile possibility of life. The cans of milk she couldn't see, the sack of flour she couldn't carry, they were a tangible promise waiting for her at the end of this journey. The hope they represented was a small, warm coal cupped in her hands, and she had to shield it from the relentless wind of her own doubt. What kind of man was Silas? Why would he do such a thing? The town's whispers painted him as a sullen, half-wild recluse, a man more comfortable with traps and skinning knives than with people. Yet, in the store, he had wielded a quiet power that had bent the smug Mr. Gable to his will. He had not offered pity, which she would have despised, nor charity, which she would have refused. He had offered a peculiar, almost formal arrangement, a contract whose terms were as murky and vast as the winter sky. The roof. "When the work is done, we will talk about the quilt." He was trading his labor, his strength, for what? For a piece of colored cloth? It made no sense, and that lack of sense was unsettling. It felt dangerous. When she finally stumbled through the door of her home, the cold, stale air was a familiar misery. Sam was exactly where she had left him, a small, silent statue in the corner. He looked up, his gray eyes wide and questioning. He had been so certain she was leaving for good. She saw the flicker of relief in his gaze, a relief so profound it broke her heart. She unwrapped Leah from her cocoon of blankets, her fingers clumsy with cold. The baby was limp, her skin a pale, waxy color. For one horrifying moment, Alara thought she was too late. But then, a tiny, fluttering sigh escaped the baby's blue-tinged lips. She was still breathing, still fighting. Alara laid her on the bed and chafed her tiny hands and feet, trying to bring some life back into them, whispering her name over and over like an incantation. "Leah, Leah, my love, just hold on a little longer. Help is coming." She worked on the fire, using the last of the splintered crate to coax the embers back into a small, struggling flame. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every gust of wind against the sod walls sounded like footsteps, and she would freeze, her heart hammering in her chest. She was caught between a desperate need for Silas to arrive and a deep-seated fear of his arrival. He was a stranger, an unknown quantity, and she would be alone with him, miles from anyone. What did she truly know of him, other than that he lived apart and that the townsfolk mistrusted him? He arrived not with a knock, but as a sudden shadow darkening the doorway. He was simply there, a crate balanced on one shoulder, the folded quilt under his other arm. He filled the entrance, his sheer size diminishing the small room. He stepped inside without being invited, his presence immediately dominating the space. He set the crate down on the dirt floor with a solid thud. The sound of it, the sound of substance and sustenance, was the most beautiful thing Alara had ever heard. He did not look at her. His eyes swept the room, taking in the meager fire, the bare shelves, the silent boy in the corner, the pale infant on the bed. It was a quick, comprehensive assessment, devoid of judgment. It was the look of a man cataloging facts, assessing a problem. He unpacked the crate with an economy of motion. The cans of milk, the heavy sack of flour, the small bag of coffee beans, a slab of salt pork she hadn't even seen him ask for. He placed them on the small, rough-hewn table Thomas had made. Then he placed the quilt beside them. The room, which had been a vessel of emptiness, now held the weight of survival. "There is a can opener in the crate," he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned his attention to the fire, poking it with a stick. "You'll need more wood." He looked over at Sam, who was watching him with a child's unfiltered curiosity, fear warring with fascination. Silas's expression did not change, but he seemed to soften in some indefinable way. He reached into a pocket of his fur coat and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He held it out. Sam shrank back at first, but Silas simply placed it on the floor, a few feet away from the boy, and then straightened up, ignoring it. It was a quiet offering, left to be accepted or refused. Alara, meanwhile, was fumbling with a can of milk, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the opener. The simple mechanics of it felt impossibly complex. Finally, the tin lid peeled back, revealing the thick, creamy liquid within. She poured a small amount into a cup and diluted it with a little boiled water, her movements frantic. She lifted Leah's head, tipping the cup to her lips. The baby, weak as she was, responded to the scent, her mouth working instinctively. A few drops trickled in, then a few more. She swallowed. It was a miracle. A small, simple, life-altering miracle. Alara felt tears streaming down her face, hot against her cold skin. She didn't bother to wipe them away. She was focused entirely on the small, rhythmic motion of her daughter's throat as she drank. When Leah had taken all she could, her body relaxed into a deep, peaceful sleep, the first she'd had in days. Her breathing evened out, the pinched, pained look on her face smoothing away. Alara carefully poured a little of the remaining milk into another cup for Sam. He crept from his corner, his eyes still on Silas, and took the cup with both hands. He drank it down in 3 long swallows, a thin white mustache appearing on his upper lip. He looked at his mother, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, and a slow, shy smile, the first she had seen in weeks, spread across his face. Only then did she look up at Silas. He was watching her, his expression as unreadable as ever. He had given her this moment. He had given her back her children. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate, flimsy things. He gave a short, sharp nod in response, accepting the thanks but not dwelling on it. He was already turning his attention back to the practicalities of the situation. "The horse is thin," he stated. "There is hay in my barn. I'll bring a bale. Then I'll see to the roof." He turned and was gone as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving the scent of pine and cold air in his wake. Alara sank onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling with a combination of relief, gratitude, and a profound, unnerving sense of obligation. She looked at the supplies on her table, at the sleeping baby, at the boy now tentatively touching the carved bird. Silas had not just brought food. He had brought order to her chaos, a plan where she had only seen a dead end. He was a force of nature, as quiet and inexorable as the winter itself. And she, in her desperation, had invited that force into her life. The quilt lay on the table, its colors a silent testament to the strange and binding contract she had made. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet, purposeful activity. Alara moved as if in a dream, her actions dictated by the simple, overwhelming needs of her children. She heated more milk for Sam, this time mixing in a spoonful of flour to make a thin, nourishing porridge. He ate with a solemn intensity, scraping the bowl clean. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sod house was filled not with the sound of weeping, but with the gentle hiss of a simmering pot and the quiet breathing of a sleeping child. The fear that had been a constant, cold knot in her stomach began to loosen its grip, replaced by a cautious, fragile warmth that had little to do with the fire. She found herself watching the door, listening for Silas's return. His presence was a disquieting puzzle she couldn't solve. He was not a neighbor performing a simple act of kindness. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered condolences. They did not restructure your life with grim efficiency. His help felt elemental, like a fallen tree providing shelter in a storm. It was there, it was useful, but it owed you nothing and asked for nothing you could understand. Late in the afternoon, he reappeared. He didn't come to the door, but went straight to the lean-to, a large bale of hay tied to his back that would have buckled another man. She watched through the single, small window as he cut the bindings and spread the hay for her horse, an old mare named Bess who had been Thomas's pride. He ran a hand down the animal's bony flank, his movements calm and sure. The horse, usually skittish with strangers, seemed to lean into his touch. Then, He turned his attention to the house itself. He had a ladder of his own making and tools she did not recognize. With methodical purpose, he climbed onto the roof of the soddy. Soon, she could hear him above her, the dull thud and scrape of his work a reassuring rhythm against the ceaseless whine of the wind. He was packing the seams with fresh sod and mud he must have cut and mixed before the ground froze solid, sealing the weak spots Thomas had never had the chance to finish. Each sound from the roof was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her immediate despair. He was literally mending her shelter, pushing back against the wilderness that sought to reclaim her and her children. It was the most profound act of care she had ever witnessed, and it was performed by a man who had barely spoken 10 words to her. As dusk began to bleed across the gray sky, tinting the snow outside with shades of lavender and steel, the sounds from the roof ceased. A short while later, a dark shape appeared at her door. It was Silas. He did not enter, but simply stood on the threshold, his silhouette framed by the fading light. "The roof will hold," he said. It was a promise. He then placed something on the ground by the door, 2 skinned rabbits, clean and ready for the pot. Beside them, a pail of fresh milk, steam rising from its surface. He had a goat, she remembered vaguely hearing someone say. A nanny goat that had somehow survived the winter. "The goat has extra," he said, preempting the question in her eyes. Before she could form a reply, a word of thanks, he turned to leave. "Wait," she called out, her voice stronger now. He paused, his back to her. She looked around her small home, at the supplies he had provided, and felt a desperate need to reciprocate, to make this an exchange between equals, not a handout to a beggar. Her eyes landed on his coat. She had noticed it in the store, a tear in the shoulder seam, crudely stitched with thick, clumsy thread. "Your coat," she said, stepping closer. "The seam is torn. I'm a good seamstress. My mother taught me." He was silent for a long moment. She thought he might refuse, that her offer was an insignificant gesture against the magnitude of his help. He slowly turned, his dark eyes searching her face in the dim light. He seemed to be weighing her words, her intention. Finally, he shrugged out of the heavy fur-lined coat and handed it to her. The garment was heavy, imbued with the scent of wood smoke, pine, and the cold, clean air of the wilderness. It felt intensely personal, an extension of the man himself. "There is no hurry," he said, and then he was gone, vanishing into the deepening twilight. She brought the coat inside, closing the door against the night. The rabbits and the milk were a gift of life. The coat was a gift of trust. She hung it on a peg by the door, where it looked enormous, a wild and protective presence in her small, domestic space. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, she lit a tallow candle and sat at the table with the coat. The stew she had made from one of the rabbits simmered on the hearth, filling the soddy with a rich, savory aroma. She found her sewing kit, a small leather pouch of needles and threads that had been her mother's. With delicate, precise movements, she picked out the clumsy stitches Silas had made. The leather was thick and tough, but her needle was sharp. As she worked, she thought about the man. He lived as she did now, alone, on the edge of the world. But where she was shrinking, fading, he seemed to be a part of the landscape, as resilient and enduring as the ancient rocks that broke the surface of the prairie. He understood its language of silence, of action, of brutal necessity. He had not offered her comforting words. He had offered her a solid roof, a full larder, and the means to fight another day. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of perfect, ordered care against the wildness of the material. It was all she had to give. She was mending more than just a seam in a coat. She was stitching together the frayed edges of her own life, reestablishing a small measure of control, of purpose. This was a trade she understood, his strength for her skill, his provision for her care. It was a silent conversation, a partnership forged without pleasantries or promises. When she finished, the seam was nearly invisible, the torn leather drawn together in a strong, clean line. She ran her fingers over her work, a flicker of pride warming her. She placed the coat back on the peg, ready for his return. She did not know when he would be back, but she knew he would come. The pail of milk, the rabbits on the doorstep, they were the opening lines of a new chapter. The quilt, still folded on the table, was the unspoken contract, its final terms yet to be written. For the first time since Thomas's death, as she lay down to sleep, The sound of the wind did not seem like a threat, but like a wild, lonely song. And for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone in listening to it. A new rhythm established itself, as quiet and steady as a winter heartbeat. Every 2 days, Silas would appear at the edge of her clearing, usually in the low, gray light of dawn or the deep purple of twilight. He never knocked. He would simply leave his offerings on the large, flat stone near her door, a pail of milk, a brace of rabbits, sometimes a grouse or a piece of venison wrapped in canvas. He was a phantom provider, a force that sustained her from a distance. In return, she would leave something for him on the same stone. After she had repaired his coat, which he had collected one morning before she was even awake, she began to bake bread. Using the flour he had provided, she would bake 2 loaves, one for her family and one for him. The first time she left a loaf, wrapped in a clean dishcloth, she worried he might see it as an insult, a paltry offering. But the next morning, the bread was gone, and the dishcloth was left behind, neatly folded. This silent, meticulous reciprocity became their language. They were 2 solitary islands, communicating not with words, but with the essential currency of survival, food, warmth, and labor. She mended his gloves, reinforcing the fingers with scraps of leather from a pair of Thomas's old boots. He left a small, expertly crafted sled for Sam, perfect for pulling firewood or for the simple joy of sliding down a snowy incline. She found a small tin of salve she had made and left it for him after noticing a deep, raw cut on his hand one evening. He, in turn, left a perfectly sharpened axe head by her woodpile, its edge gleaming. This exchange of objects formed a fragile, growing web of connection between them. Each item left on the stone was a sentence in a long, slow conversation. I see your need. I recognize your skill. We are in this together. The children began to thrive. Leah's cheeks grew plump and pink, her cries turning into robust demands. She was a different child, a baby brought back from the brink. Sam, too, began to shed the shell of his silent grief. He would spend hours with the small wooden bird Silas had carved, making it swoop and fly through the air. He started to speak again, at first in single words, then in short, questioning sentences. "Men come back?" he would ask, peering out the window into the snow. "Yes, Sammy. He'll be back," she would reply, the certainty in her voice surprising even herself. But their strange, isolated peace was not invisible. The settlement of Promise, though 2 miles away, had long eyes and even longer tongues. On a rare, sunlit day when the wind had died down, Alara harnessed the mare to the buckboard and made the trip into town for salt and thread. The moment she stepped into Gable's store, she felt the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The 2 women who had been there before were there again, their knitting needles clicking like the mandibles of insects. They stopped their chatter and watched her, their eyes sharp and judgmental. Mrs. Gable gave her a tight, disapproving smile. "Mrs. Reed, you're looking better," she said, loading the word with insinuation. Alara ignored the bait. "I need salt," she said, keeping her voice level. As Mr. Gable weighed out the salt, his wife leaned conspiratorially over the counter. "It is not my place," she began, which was always a prelude to making something her place. "But people are talking. A woman alone, with a man like that coming and going from her claim. It is not respectable. He is not our kind. He is a good neighbor," Alara stated simply, her gaze unwavering. "Good neighbors do not isolate a widow from the community," Mrs. Gable countered, her voice dropping to a sanctimonious whisper. "They do not create scandal. Whatever arrangement you have with him, it will bring you nothing but trouble. Mark my words." Alara paid for her salt, her hands steady, her expression calm. But inside, a cold anger was stirring. The community had offered her nothing but scorn and a closed door when she was at her lowest. They had been content to let her and her children starve. Her survival was an affront to them, and the fact that it was facilitated by an outcast they couldn't control was even worse. Her private battle for life had become a public spectacle, a source of gossip and condemnation. Her resolve hardened. Let them talk. Their words were nothing compared to the howling of the wind or the cries of a hungry child. Her world had shrunk to the 4 mud walls of her home, the patch of land Thomas had claimed, and the silent man who helped her defend it. The opinions of Promise were a distant, irrelevant noise. The encounter, however, planted a seed of unease. It reminded her that the world was larger than her small circle of survival, and that world had rules and expectations that she was now flagrantly violating. A new threat emerged a week later, not from the whispers of the town, but in the form of a man on a fine horse, dressed in a city coat. He introduced himself as Mr. Finch, an agent for a land speculation company from the east. He was a man whose smiles did not reach his eyes, which were small and quick, constantly assessing, calculating. "A tragedy. What happened to your husband?" he said, removing his hat with a flourish that was entirely out of place in front of a sod house. "A terrible tragedy. This is a hard land for a man, let alone a woman on her own." He gestured expansively at the horizon. "My company is authorized to offer fair compensation to settlers who find themselves overextended. We can take this claim off your hands, give you enough to get a train ticket back east, back to your family." "My family is here," Elara said, her hand resting on Sam's shoulder. "This land is ours. My husband filed the claim. We have worked it." Finch's smile tightened. "Of course, but the Homestead Act has provisions. A claim must be continuously improved. A land office inspector could see this situation and deem it abandoned. Forfeited. We would simply be helping you liquidate your assets before they are lost entirely." It was a veiled threat, delivered with the slick politeness of a predator. He saw a vulnerable widow, an easy target. He saw a piece of property, not a home. "I am not selling," she said, her voice firm. He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Think on it, Mrs. Reed. Winter is long. Things break. People get lonely. It is always good to have a friend with ready cash. I'll be back." He tipped his hat, climbed back on his horse, and rode away, leaving a trail of profound menace in his wake. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up again, and it seemed to carry Finch's insinuating voice. A land office inspector could deem it abandoned. He could, with a word, with a lie, strip her of the one thing she had left. The land was not just dirt and grass. It was Thomas's dream, her children's inheritance. And now it, too, was under siege. She was caught between the judgment of the town and the greed of outsiders. Her only ally was a silent trapper whose motives she still did not fully understand. The quilt, which she had taken to covering her children with at night, felt less like a pending debt and more like a shield, a banner of a strange, unspoken alliance. The world was pressing in, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a storm was coming, a storm made of more than just wind and snow. The days grew shorter, the cold more profound. The sky seemed to hang permanently low and heavy, a lid on a pot of simmering winter. Finch's visit had left a residue of anxiety that coated everything, a constant, low-grade fear that was different from the sharp panic of starvation. That had been a fight against nature. This was a fight against the calculated cruelty of men. She found herself scanning the horizon not for Silas, but for the telltale shape of Finch on his horse. Every distant coyote looked, for a moment, like a rider. The threat made her world feel smaller, more fragile. The sod house, once her fortress, now felt like a lonely outpost under siege. Silas continued his silent deliveries. The rhythm of their exchange was the only constant in her precarious existence. One morning, she found a string of steel traps on the stone, their jaws wired shut. There was no note, no explanation. But she understood. This was another tool, another piece of independence. It was his way of teaching her to provide for herself. She spent a frustrating day learning their mechanics, the cold metal biting at her fingers. Thomas had never been a trapper, but she was persistent. She found a game trail near the creek bed and, following an instinct she didn't know she possessed, set a snare and a trap. The next day, she found a young rabbit in the snare. The small victory was immense. She had provided. She had used the tool he had given her to feed her family. When she left his loaf of bread on the stone that evening, she felt a stronger sense of being his equal than ever before. The town remained a distant, hostile entity. She had no reason to go back, and they made no effort to reach out. She was an island, her and the children, tethered to the mainland only by the strange, invisible thread that connected her to Silas. Then, the storm came. It did not arrive with the bluster of a normal blizzard. It crept in, a slow, ominous darkening of the sky, a gradual thickening of the air. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell away into an unnerving silence. The world held its breath. Silas, who had come by the previous evening with a larger-than-usual load of firewood and a warning in his eyes, had simply said, "It will be a bad one. Keep the fire high." He had looked at the sky, then at her, and she had seen a flicker of genuine concern in his otherwise impassive face. He had gestured to the north. "My trap lines. I have to check them before it hits." And he had gone, disappearing into the gray twilight. Now, as the first flakes began to fall, not in a gentle drift but in a thick, purposeful curtain, a cold dread seized her. He was out there, alone, in the face of whatever was coming. The snow fell faster, heavier. The world beyond her window vanished, replaced by a swirling, hypnotic vortex of white. The wind returned, not as a moan, but as a physical scream. It hit the soddy like a fist, and the entire structure groaned in protest. Dirt trickled from the ceiling. The sound was terrifying, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through the very earth beneath her feet. She stoked the fire, the flames seeming to cower from the drafts that found their way in. She stuffed rags into the cracks around the door and the window frame, but it was like trying to dam a river with pebbles. The cold pressed in, relentless and invasive. Sam and Leah were bundled together on the bed, covered by every blanket she owned, the quilt a vibrant splash of color on top. Sam was quiet, his eyes wide with fear as he listened to the storm's fury. Leah slept, blissfully unaware. For hours, Alara did nothing but tend the fire and listen. The roar of the wind was the voice of a monster trying to claw its way in. She thought of Silas. Where was he? Had he made it to his cabin? Was he hunkered down in some sheltered ravine? Or was he lost in the whiteout, the cold slowly, inexorably claiming him just as it had claimed Thomas? The thought was a physical pain. She was shocked by the depth of her fear for him. In the past weeks, his silent, steady presence had become a fixture in her life, a northern star in her dark sky. The idea of that presence being extinguished was unbearable. She had come to depend on him, not just for the food and the firewood, but for the simple knowledge that someone else was out there, sharing the same struggle, breathing the same frozen air. The storm raged through the night and into the next day without pause. The world was an endless, churning chaos of snow and wind. The Sadi was a tiny, fragile bubble of warmth and life in an ocean of frozen fury. The snow began to pile up against the walls, sealing them in. The light from the window grew dimmer and dimmer until it was gone completely, blocked by a solid wall of white. They were buried. Sometime on the second day, during a brief, almost imperceptible lull in the wind's screaming, she heard a new sound. A heavy, rhythmic thumping at the door. It was not the wind. It was a fist. Her heart leaped into her throat. Silas. He had made it. She scrambled to the door, her hands clumsy as she fumbled with the wooden bar. But as she pulled it free, a voice cut through the wind, a voice that was not his. "Mrs. Reed, are you in there? It's Finch. I've come to help." Finch. The name was a jolt of ice water. Why was he here? How could he be here, in the middle of this monster? The thumping grew more insistent, more demanding. "Let me in, Mrs. Reed. You can't survive this alone. Your roof will collapse. Let me in." She hesitated, her hand on the door. His presence here was wrong, predatory. He was not here to help. He was an opportunist, a vulture circling what he believed to be a dying animal. The storm was his chance to corner her, to break her will. "We're fine," she shouted, her voice thin against the wind. "Go away. Don't be a fool, woman." His voice was sharp, angry now. "I have papers from the land office. A preliminary injunction. This storm is a godsend. It proves you can't manage this claim. Sign it over to me, and I'll see you and your children get to safety in town." The truth, raw and ugly. He was using the storm as leverage. He was trying to use the act of God to steal her land. "No," she screamed back, a surge of defiant fury washing away her fear. "This is my home. Then you will die in it," he roared, and the door shuddered as he threw his full weight against it. The wooden bar she had unlatched was all that kept him out. The door frame groaned, splintering. He was going to force his way in. She threw her own body against the door, her shoulder pressed against the rough-hewn planks, adding her meager weight to the fight. It was a hopeless, desperate gesture. He was stronger. The wood was giving way. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable crash, for the invasion of the cold, and the man who embodied its merciless nature. The wooden door groaned, the latch splintering under the assault. Alara pushed with all her might, her feet slipping on the packed earth floor. It was a futile effort against his brute force. The cold, funneled through the growing cracks, was a physical blow, carrying with it Finch's grunts of exertion and the triumphant, ugly sound of snapping wood. Despair washed over her, cold and absolute. She had survived starvation, grief, and loneliness, only to be brought down by the simple, grubbing greed of this man. Her home was being breached, her sanctuary violated. Just as the door was about to give way entirely, a new sound tore through the storm's howl, a splintering crash from the other side, followed by a choked cry of pain from Finch. The pressure against the door vanished. For a moment, there was only the roar of the wind. Then, the shattered door was shoved inward, not with violence, but with a steady, irresistible force. A figure stood there, blocking the torrent of swirling snow, a monolith of fur and ice. It was Silas. He was a creature born of the blizzard itself. Snow was caked on his shoulders, his hair and beard were frozen white, and ice clung to his eyelashes. But his eyes, dark and burning with a cold fire, were fixed on the crumpled form of Mr. Finch, who was now clutching a broken arm on the ground outside. Silas did not spare Finch another glance. His gaze swept past him and found Alara, who was pressed against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. He looked at her, at the children huddled on the bed, and a long, shuddering breath escaped his lips, misting in the frigid air. He had made it. He had come through the storm. He stepped fully inside, his presence filling the small room, pushing back the chaos. He turned and looked down at Finch, who was scrambling to his feet, his face a mask of pain and fury. "This is private property," Finch spat, cradling his arm. "You have no right." Silas took one slow step toward him. He said nothing. He did not need to. The raw, primal menace radiating from him was more potent than any shouted threat. It was the quiet fury of the wilderness itself, of a bear defending its territory. Finch, for all his bluster and legal papers, was a city man. He recognized a force he could not bully, could not cheat, could not understand. He saw in Silas's eyes not the anger of a rival, but the lethal stillness of a predator. He backed away, stumbling in the deep snow. "You'll hear from my lawyers." "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice thin and pathetic against the gale. He turned and fled, a dark shape swallowed almost instantly by the swirling white. Silas watched him go, his posture unmoving until Finch was completely gone. Only then did the rigid tension seem to drain from his massive frame. He turned back into the room and, with great effort, pushed the broken door back into its frame, wedging it shut with the splintered remains of the latch and a nearby crate. The roar of the storm was muffled once more, the relative quiet of the soddy restored. And then, as if the strings holding him up had been cut, Silas swayed on his feet. He braced a hand against the wall, his head bowed. The facade of invincible strength crumbled, revealing the man beneath. He was trembling violently, his breathing ragged and shallow. He had not just walked through the storm, he had fought it every step of the way, and it had taken nearly everything from him. "Silas," Alara whispered, moving toward him. He tried to wave her away, a gesture of deeply ingrained self-reliance, but his arm fell to his side. He slid down the wall, slumping to the floor in a heap of wet fur and exhaustion. His eyes fluttered, then closed. He had come through the blizzard, faced down her enemy, secured her home, and then collapsed. She knelt beside him, her fear for him returning with a vengeance. She touched his cheek. It was as cold as ice. His lips were blue. He was freezing to death, right here on her floor. Panic seized her for a second, sharp and paralyzing. But then, it was replaced by a fierce, clear-headed resolve. He had saved her. Now, she would save him. "Sam," she said, her voice sharp and commanding, startling her son. "Bring me the blankets." "All of them, Sam." His fear of the stranger overcome by the urgency in his mother's voice, scrambled to obey. Alara's hands worked quickly, unlacing his frozen moccasins, pulling at the stiff, icy buckskins. His clothes were a casing of ice. She had to get them off him, had to get him warm. It was a desperate, clumsy struggle. She pulled and tugged, her fingers numb, until she had managed to strip away the frozen outer layers. Beneath, his skin was frighteningly cold to the touch. With Sam's help, she dragged him closer to the fire, his body an almost unmanageable dead weight. She piled blankets on top of him, but it wasn't enough. The cold was too deep, a core cold that blankets alone couldn't touch. She looked at the bed, where Liao was still sleeping, and she looked at the quilt. The quilt. It was her past, her history, the price of her children's lives. Now it would be his. She pulled it from the bed and spread it over his still form, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to his ashen skin. It was the warmest thing she owned, thick with batting and love. She tucked it around him, trying to create a cocoon of warmth. She stoked the fire until it was roaring, using the precious wood he had brought her. She brewed coffee, the strong, bitter aroma filling the air. She sat by his side, rubbing his hands, his arms, trying to force life and warmth back into him through the sheer force of her will. She held a cup of hot coffee to his lips, trying to trickle some of the warm liquid into his mouth. Hours passed. The storm continued its assault outside, but the world within the Saudi had shrunk to this one task. Her children watched, silent and wide-eyed, from the bed. They were witnessing a profound and elemental struggle. This was no longer about a debt, a trade, or a strange arrangement. This was about life and death. This was about two solitary people on a vast, merciless plain, fighting to keep a single flame from being extinguished. As she worked, she saw him not as the town did, as a mysterious, half-wild outcast, but as a man. She saw the scars on his hands from a life of hard labor and close calls. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. She saw the raw vulnerability of a man pushed beyond the limits of his own formidable strength. In his collapse, he had become utterly human to her. And in her desperate, focused care, she felt a shift within herself. The fear, the grief, the feeling of being a victim of circumstance, it was all burning away in the heat of her purpose. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a protector. She was fighting back. And as she tucked the edge of her mother's quilt more tightly around his shoulder, she knew, with absolute certainty, that its purpose had never been to be traded for milk or sold for passage. Its purpose was this, right here, right now, to be a blanket of warmth and life for the man who had saved them all. The storm raged for another full day, entombing them in a world of white and sound. Inside the Saudi, time stretched and compressed, measured only by the crackle of the fire and the rhythm of Silas's breathing. Alara did not sleep. She maintained her vigil, a sentinel in the heart of the blizzard. She kept the fire blazing hot, turning the small room into a stuffy, humid sanctuary. She forced sips of hot broth and coffee between Silas's lips whenever he stirred. Slowly, painstakingly, the life she was pouring into him began to take root. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, steady warmth that started in his chest and gradually spread to his limbs. The deadly pallor of his skin gave way to a healthier color. He drifted in and out of a deep, exhausted sleep, occasionally murmuring words she couldn't understand, fragments of dreams from a life she couldn't imagine. During his brief moments of lucidity, his eyes would find hers, and in them, she saw not confusion or fear, but a dawning awareness, a quiet acknowledgement of where he was and who was caring for him. In these moments, the silence between them was more profound than any conversation. The roles had been completely reversed. He, the strong, silent provider, was now helpless, dependent, and she, the desperate widow, was now the source of strength and care. The quilt was wrapped around him, a vibrant shield against the cold. Her children, accepting this strange new reality, were quiet and helpful. Sam brought her pieces of wood for the fire without being asked, his small face serious with purpose. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. This man, this stranger, was now part of their small, fragile family unit. For the first time since she had met him, Silas was inside her home not as a visitor on the threshold, but as a resident of its hearth. His presence, even in stillness, changed the very character of the room. His rifle leaned in the corner. His boots, now dry, sat by the fire. The space felt less empty, more defended. The vulnerability of caring for him forged a strange and powerful intimacy. She tended to him with a practicality that bypassed modesty. She washed his face with a warm cloth. She checked the cut on his hand. She saw the map of old scars on his torso. These were not the actions of a stranger, but of someone deeply entwined in another's fate. And in this intimacy, she found a surprising lack of fear. The man who had been a mystery, a figure of intimidating competence, was now just a man, made of flesh and bone, susceptible to the same cold and weariness as anyone else. His collapse had not made him smaller in her eyes, but infinitely more real. On the third morning, the wind finally died. The sudden, absolute silence was more jarring than the storm's roar had been. It was as if the world had been muted. Alara pushed against the makeshift barrier at the door, and it swung open onto a transformed landscape. The world was gone. In its place was a new geography of immense, sculpted drifts, a sea of white that buried fences, erased paths, and softened every hard edge of the prairie. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the sun so bright on the snow it was painful to look at. The air was crystalline, pure, and breathtakingly cold. It was a world reborn, washed clean. She turned back inside to find Silas awake. He had pushed himself up into a sitting position against the wall, the quilt pooled around his waist. He looked weak, but his eyes were clear. He watched her, his expression one she had never seen before. The stoic mask was gone, replaced by a raw, open gratitude. "The storm has passed," she said, her voice soft in the quiet room. He nodded, his gaze moving from her face to the children, then around the small, warm space. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was raspy, but the words were clear, stripped of all artifice. "You saved ours first," she replied simply. An understanding passed between them, deep and unspoken. The debts were paid. The scales were balanced. What remained was something new, something that had not been part of their original, unspoken contract. He tried to stand, but his legs were unsteady. She moved to his side, putting a hand on his arm to steady him. The contact was electric, a current of warmth and connection that startled them both. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up to her face. For the first time, she saw not a wild man of the plains, but a man who was profoundly lonely. "Thank you, Alara," he said, and the use of her name, the first time he had spoken it with such softness, was more intimate than any touch. Later that day, he was strong enough to stand, to move about the small cabin. He ate the stew she gave him, his appetite a sign of his returning strength. He spoke more than he ever had before, not about anything of consequence, but about the storm, about how he had lost his way and followed the faint scent of her wood smoke the last half-mile, a desperate gamble that had paid off. He spoke of the way the snow had felt, not like flakes, but like a wall of sand, scouring and blinding. She, in turn, told him of Finch's arrival, of the terror she had felt when the door began to splinter. As they spoke, the vast, empty spaces that had defined their relationship began to fill in. He was no longer just a provider, and she was no longer just a recipient. They were two people who had weathered the same storm, both inside her home and out in the world. He saw the strength in her, the fierce, unyielding core that had refused to break. And she saw the man behind the myth, a man capable of loyalty, of courage, and of profound vulnerability. The quilt lay folded at the foot of her bed, its job done. It was no longer a symbol of a painful trade or a desperate bargain. It was a testament to their shared survival, its threads woven into the fabric of their intertwined lives. When evening came, a quiet domesticity settled over the soddy. Silas sat by the fire, expertly carving a new, more intricate latch for the broken door. Alara sat at the table, mending a tear in Sam's trousers. The children slept soundly, their world secure. The silence was no longer empty or tense, but comfortable, companionable. It was the silence of two people who had no need for words to understand one another. He was a part of her home now. The storm had breached her walls and brought him inside, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would never be truly alone again. In the white, silent world that followed the blizzard, a new kind of life began. The storm had been a crucible, burning away the old anxieties and forging something new and resilient in their place. Finch did not return. The memory of Silas, a figure of pure, untamed fury emerging from the storm, was a more powerful deterrent than any lock or deed. The threat of the outside world, for now, had receded, leaving them in a pocket of profound peace. Silas stayed. There was no discussion, no formal invitation. It was an unspoken, mutual understanding. His cabin was likely buried, his trap lines destroyed. Her soddy was standing, warm, and stocked with the provisions he had provided. It was a matter of simple, practical survival. But it was more than that. The shared ordeal had created a bond that neither of them was willing to break. He moved with a quiet purpose, his presence seamlessly integrating into the small household. He dug them out, clearing a path from the door and carving snow canyon walls around the house. He showed her how to read the snow, to find the game that had survived the storm. He taught Sam how to tie knots, his large, scarred hands patient and gentle with the boy's small fingers. He was a natural teacher. His lessons conveyed more through action than through words. He would point to a track, a broken twig, the behavior of a bird, and wait for her to see what he saw. In turn, she brought a softness and order to his life. She made sure there was always hot coffee, that his meals were steady, that his clothes were mended. The soddy, which had been a place of grief and fear, slowly transformed into a home, filled with the low murmur of their voices, the scent of baking bread, and the laughter of her children, who had unequivocally adopted him as their own. Sam would follow him everywhere, a small shadow mimicking his long strides. Leah, now sitting up on her own, would break into a gummy smile whenever he entered the room, reaching for him with her chubby arms. He would hold her with a surprising tenderness, his large, rough hands a safe harbor for her small body. Their conversations remained sparse, but they were no longer strained. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, the children asleep, and share long, comfortable silences. Sometimes he would tell her a story about the land, about the habits of a wolf pack or the meaning of a certain cloud formation. He spoke of the prairie not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a living entity to be understood and respected. She, in turn, would speak of her life back in Ohio, of the green hills and the crowded towns, a world that seemed a lifetime away. She spoke of Thomas, not with the sharp, immediate pain of fresh grief, but with a gentle, wistful sadness. Silas would listen, his gaze steady on the fire, allowing her the space to unpack her memories without judgment. He never offered platitudes or easy comfort, only his quiet, unwavering attention, which was a far greater gift. One evening, as she was putting the quilt away in the trunk, he spoke from his seat by the fire. "That is a fine thing," he said, his eyes on the flash of color. "My mother made it," she replied, her hands smoothing over the fabric. She would be happy to know it kept a good man from freezing. He was silent for a long time. "My mother was Lakota," he said finally, the words quiet but heavy with significance. "She taught me the ways of this land. My father was a trapper, a white man. He taught me the ways of the town." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a deep, ancient sadness. "I do not belong fully to either." It was a confession, a key to the puzzle of who he was. He was a man caught between two worlds, at home in neither, an outcast by birth. The town's suspicion, her own initial fear, it all clicked into place. He lived apart because he had been set apart his entire life. She closed the lid of the trunk and went to sit on the small stool near the hearth, closer to him than she usually sat. "It seems to me," she said softly, "that you belong right here." His gaze met hers, and in that look, years of solitude and guardedness seemed to fall away. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but his grip was gentle. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, elemental connection. A promise of partnership, a recognition of home. As the winter slowly began to release its grip on the land, their life together took on the permanence of the changing seasons. He rebuilt the lean-to, stronger this time. She planted a small garden in the soil he helped her till. They worked side by side, a team, their movements synchronized, their purpose shared. The land was still hard, the life still precarious. But the crushing loneliness was gone. They faced the vast, indifferent prairie together, two solitary figures who had found their anchor in one another. Alara had come to this land with a husband, seeking a dream of prosperity. She had lost that husband and nearly lost that dream. But in the depths of her despair, In the heart of the harshest winter, she had found something else entirely. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed. She had found a partner whose soul spoke the same silent language as her own. She was no longer the lone widow of the Badlands. She was a woman of the plains, her roots dug deep into the sod, nurtured by hardship and strengthened by a love as quiet and powerful as the land itself. The quilt remained in the trunk, a beautiful map of her journey from a past she had cherished to a future she had forged with her own two hands. Hope, she had learned, was not a thing you waited for. It was a shelter you built, stitch by stitch, day by day, against the wind.